The dust of the Capitol Road still clung to Arthur's worn sandals as he trudged toward the village of his birth, a donkey of questionable intelligence plodding behind him. The animal, which Arthur had named Sultan out of spite, carried 2 sacks containing everything the once celebrated advisor now possessed in this world: 3 books, a copper pot, 1 moth-eaten blanket, and a wheel of cheese that had seen better centuries. "Expelled," Arthur muttered to himself, his eyes twinkling despite his circumstances. Expelled for suggesting that the royal treasury might benefit from the revolutionary concept of mathematics. Apparently, counting money is an insult to those who prefer to simply feel wealthy. So the donkey brayed in what Arthur chose to interpret as agreement. The village of Dustbury emerged from the horizon like a collection of mud-colored teeth rising from brown gums. Nothing had changed in the 15 years since Arthur had left to seek his fortune in the capital, except perhaps everything had grown slightly more crooked, as if the entire village had given up on the concept of straight lines. "Home," Arthur announced, with theatrical grandeur, "where I shall finally rest upon the land my father left me, tend to my olive grove, and live out my days in peaceful obscurity." Surely nothing could possibly complicate such a simple plan. The universe, as it often did with Arthur, took this as a personal challenge. He approached his family estate, a modest but comfortable house surrounded by the finest olive grove in the region, only to find the gate barred and a crudely painted sign that read, "Property of the Consortium of Rightful Inheritors. Trespassers will be complained about." Arthur blinked. He removed his spectacles, cleaned them on his dusty robe, and blinked again. The sign remained. "Consortium of Rightful Inheritors," he repeated slowly. "How wonderfully official. I do so admire a good consortium." Before he could investigate further, a window in the house flew open and a face appeared, round, red, and possessing the kind of mustache that suggested its owner made important decisions about other people's property. "Away with you, vagrant! This is private property, legally acquired, documented, stamped with no fewer than 3 official stamps." "George?" Arthur squinted. "The same George who once ate an entire candle because I told it was a special foreign cheese?" The face, indeed, belonging to his cousin George, turned a deeper shade of crimson. "I have no idea what you are talking about. I am George the landowner now, and I demand you remove yourself and your obviously stolen donkey from our rightful premises." "Ours?" Arthur's eyebrow rose with the practiced grace of a man who had spent years navigating royal courts. 3 more faces appeared at various windows, like a theatrical production with a very limited budget. Arthur recognized each one with the dawning horror of a man realizing his family tree was more of a family tumbleweed. Thomas, his second cousin, appeared from a downstairs window shouting encouragement while carefully positioning himself behind a thick curtain. "Yes, be gone! We have weapons, probably. George, do we have weapons?" Edward, the youngest of the cousins, waved cheerfully from the roof, apparently forgetting whose side he was on. "Hello, Arthur! You look terrible. Did you know we live in your house now?" William, the eldest and most dramatic, emerged onto the balcony wrapped in what appeared to be Arthur's father's ceremonial prayer shawl, clutching his chest as if Arthur's mere presence caused him physical pain. "The prodigal son returns to haunt us. I knew this day would come. I have prepared myself spiritually for this confrontation. I have made peace with my inevitable doom." "You seem to have also made peace with my father's silverware," Arthur observed, noting the familiar glint of family heirlooms through the windows. At this moment, a commotion arose from inside the house, a sound Arthur recognized with the familiarity of a man who had spent 20 years married to its source. The front door burst open, and Margaret emerged like a storm that had been given human form and a particularly unflattering headscarf. She was carrying a broom, which she wielded with the expertise of a woman who had defeated many things in her life, including Arthur's dignity on numerous occasions.
"There you are!" she shrieked, and for one glorious moment the four cousins believed salvation had arrived in the form of this magnificent fury. "I've been trapped in that kitchen for 3 days while these imbeciles argue about which rooms they deserve. 3 days, Arthur! Do you know what I've had to eat? Olives from your trees, which these thieves are apparently now calling their trees." "My darling wife," Arthur said, with the calm of a man standing in the eye of a hurricane, "how I've missed your dulcet tones." "Don't you dulcet tones me! I told you that working for the Sultan was a terrible idea. Oh, Margaret, you said, the Sultan appreciates wisdom, you said. Well, apparently the Sultan appreciates exile more, and while you were busy being appreciated all the way out of the capital, your relatives decided to steal our house." George leaned out his window with newfound confidence. "We didn't steal anything. We inherited it, legally, through a perfectly legitimate process involving Mayor Bernard, several documents, and absolutely no bribes whatsoever." Arthur stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Ah, yes, Mayor Bernard. The same Mayor Bernard who once sold the village well to a merchant, then sold the same well to the merchant's competitor, then convinced both of them they'd gotten the better deal." "He's changed," Thomas shouted from behind his curtain. "He's an official now, with a chain of office and everything." "The chain of office," Arthur mused, "that he borrowed from the traveling theater troupe and never returned." A heavy silence fell over the scene. Sultan, the donkey, took the opportunity to eat a decorative shrub. "Nevertheless," declared William from his balcony, having worked himself into a fresh, dramatic frenzy, "the documents are legal, the stamps are official, and possession, as they say, is 9/10 of the law. The other 10th is having the mayor on your side, which we also have." Arthur looked at his wife, who was still gripping her broom with murderous intent. He looked at his cousins, arranged in their windows like a portrait of greed with multiple frames. He looked at his childhood home, now occupied by those who had never done an honest day's work in their collective lives. And Arthur smiled, the particular smile of a fool who knows exactly what he's doing. "Well, then," he said, settling himself on a nearby rock with the air of a man preparing for a long and entertaining siege, "I suppose I shall have to have a word with this Mayor Bernard. After all, I would hate for there to be any misunderstandings about the nature of law, inheritance, and the fascinating subject of official stamps." "What's that supposed to mean?" George demanded. "Absolutely nothing," I replied cheerfully. "I am but a simple fool, expelled from the capital for knowing too much arithmetic. What could I possibly do against a consortium with 3 official stamps?" Margaret glared at him. "You have a plan, don't you?" "My dear wife, I am grievously offended by the suggestion that I am capable of planning anything. I shall simply observe, learn, perhaps ask a few innocent questions." "Your innocent questions," Margaret reminded him, "once convinced a tax collector that he owed money to himself." "A simple misunderstanding of fiscal policy," Arthur said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I must find accommodations for Sultan the donkey. He's had a very long journey, and unlike some people, he has never once tried to steal my olive trees." He turned and walked away, leaving his cousins confused, his wife exasperated, and the stage set for what would become the most spectacular demonstration of foolish wisdom the village had ever witnessed.
The following morning arrived with the sort of aggressive sunshine that suggested the universe was in an irritatingly good mood. Arthur had spent the night in the village's only inn, an establishment called the Comfortable Traveler by someone who had clearly never experienced either comfort or travel. Margaret had complained about the bed, the walls, the ceiling, the concept of sleep itself, and then fallen into a snoring slumber that shook dust from the rafters. Arthur, meanwhile, had been thinking. "You're doing that thing with your face," Margaret announced over breakfast, which consisted of bread that predated their marriage and tea that tasted of regret. "That thing where you look like a fool, but you're actually being clever. I hate that thing." "I have no idea what you mean, my love. I am simply enjoying this magnificent bread." Arthur attempted to bite through it and failed. "Truly a triumph of the baker's art." "You're going to do something stupid that turns out to be brilliant, aren't you? And I'm going to spend the whole time not knowing which part we're in." "I am merely going to pay my respects to Mayor Bernard. A simple social call, nothing more." Margaret's eyes narrowed with 20 years of accumulated suspicion. "You're bringing the cheese, aren't you?" Arthur smiled and retrieved the ancient wheel of cheese from his belongings. It had, if anything, grown more pungent overnight. Sultan the donkey refused to stand downwind of it. The mayor's office occupied the grandest building in Dustbury, which meant it had 2 floors and windows that actually contained glass. Mayor Bernard had requisitioned it from the previous mayor through a complex legal process involving the previous mayor mysteriously deciding to relocate to a distant country after his house caught fire 3 times in 1 week. Arthur approached the building with the wheel of cheese tucked under his arm like an aromatic weapon of bureaucratic destruction. The mayor's secretary, a thin, nervous man named Philip, who had the permanent expression of someone expecting to be blamed for something, looked up as Arthur entered. "Good morning," Arthur announced cheerfully. "I am here to see the mayor regarding a small matter of inheritance, property law, and what I can only assume is a clerical error of monumental proportions." Philip's eye twitched. "I don't think that's how appointments work." "This cheese," Arthur explained, placing it on Philip's desk with ceremonial gravity, "was given to my family by a wandering merchant who claimed it was blessed by a holy man in the eastern mountains. It has been aging for 47 years. It is said that whoever consumes it will be granted extraordinary wisdom." Philip stared at the cheese with a combination of horror and fascination. "It smells like something died inside something else that was already dead. That's how you know it's working." At this moment, the door to the inner office burst open, and Mayor Bernard emerged in all his theatrical glory. He was a large man who wore his chain of office, still bearing faint traces of theatrical paint, as if it were the crown jewels themselves. His robes were silk, his rings were numerous, and his mustache was waxed into points that could theoretically be used as weapons. "What is that magnificent smell?" Bernard bellowed, inhaling deeply. "It reminds me of profit, of success, of cheese." "Mayor Bernard," Arthur prostrated himself with exaggerated humility, "greatest of administrators, wisest of officials, most legitimate of stamp possessors, I come bearing a gift." Bernard's eyes fixed on the cheese with the hunger of a man who measured everything by its potential value. "Is that aged mountain cheese, the kind blessed by holy men? You know of it?" "Know of it? My grandmother spoke of such cheese. She said a single taste could make a man wise beyond measure." Bernard was practically salivating. "Who are you, generous stranger?" "I am but a humble traveler, expelled from the capital for creative differences with the Sultan's accounting methods. My name is Arthur, and I seek only to resolve a small confusion regarding my family's property." The mayor's expression flickering through several emotions, recognition, concern, calculation, and finally a mask of welcoming warmth that convinced no one. Arthur, of course, the famous Arthur. I have heard tales of your wisdom from the capital. Come into my office. Philip, hold all my appointments and bring plates. This cheese must be honored properly." Philip watched them enter the inner office with the expression of a man who had just witnessed the opening moves of a chess game played by lunatics. The mayor's office was decorated in a style best described as aggressive prosperity. Gold-painted frames held portraits of Bernard himself in various heroic poses. A large desk dominated the room, covered in papers that were mostly stamps, stamps that were mostly decorative, and decorations that were mostly stolen. "Now then," Bernard said, settling into a chair that resembled a throne suffering from an identity crisis, "what seems to be the trouble with your property?" Arthur sat in the smaller chair provided for visitors, the one specifically designed to make petitioners feel insignificant. He cradled the cheese like a precious infant. "It seems, Your Magnificence, that during my absence serving the Sultan, my beloved cousins have somehow come to believe that my family's estate belongs to them. I'm certain this is simply a misunderstanding of the complex legal procedures involved in inheritance." "Ah, yes, the Consortium of Rightful Inheritors, a perfectly legitimate organization. They presented documents. I stamped them. Very official. 3 stamps. 3 stamps, Arthur repeated with apparent awe. How wonderfully thorough. Tell me, these documents, did they perhaps originate from your office? Certainly not. They were brought to me by the consortium, already written. I merely verified their authenticity by stamping them. Exactly. That's what stamps are for, to make things authentic." Arthur nodded slowly, as if receiving great wisdom. "I see. And the fee for such authentication?" He shifted uncomfortably. "A modest administrative charge, hardly worth mentioning. Now, about this cheese." "Fascinating," Arthur continued, as if he hadn't heard. "You see, I've been thinking about stamps. Powerful things, stamps. A stamp can make a document official. But I wonder, can a stamp make something true?" "What do you mean?" "Well, for example," Arthur produced a piece of paper from his robe. "If I were to write on this paper that the moon is made of cheese, appropriate given our current situation, and you were to stamp it 3 times, would the moon become cheese?" Bernard laughed nervously. "Don't be ridiculous. The moon is obviously not cheese." "But the paper would say it is, officially, with stamps." "That's different. That's astronomy. Property law is much simpler." "Is it?" Arthur leaned forward with the innocent expression that had caused 3 royal advisors to resign in confusion. "Tell me, Mayor Bernard, when my father died 15 years ago, what was the legal procedure for inheritance in this village?" "The standard procedure. Registration of death, reading of the will, transfer of property to the named heir." "And I was the named heir." "Presumably. I wasn't mayor then." "No, you weren't. But the records exist, don't they, in your archive, carefully preserved?" Bernard's eye twitched almost imperceptibly. "The archive suffered a small fire last year. Many old records were damaged. Tragic, really. Irreplaceable documents, lost forever. Which is why the consortium's documents, recent, undamaged, properly stamped, became the only valid proof of ownership." Arthur sat back, still smiling. "A fire. How unfortunate. How remarkably specifically unfortunate. These things happen. I really must insist we honor this magnificent gift properly." Of course." Arthur stood, still holding the cheese. "But I wouldn't dream of offering such a treasure until the matter of my property is resolved. You see, this cheese has a condition attached to it. My grandmother, who received it from my grandfather, who received it from the wandering merchant, specified that it must only be given to someone who has done our family a great service." "A great service?" "Indeed.
So you see my predicament. I cannot give you this cheese until you have helped me. But if my property is lost, how can I ever repay such help? It's quite a puzzle." Bernard's expression underwent a fascinating transformation as greed wrestled with corruption. "Perhaps there might be some avenue for review. These matters are complex. The consortium's claim could be re-examined." Could it? For the right considerations. Arthur bowed deeply. "Your wisdom is exceeded only by your integrity, Mayor Bernard. I shall leave you to contemplate the complexities of property law, and I shall keep this cheese safe until such contemplation bears fruit." He swept out of the office, leaving the mayor staring after him with the expression of a man who had just been outmaneuvered but couldn't quite identify how. Outside, Margaret was waiting with Sultan the donkey and an expression that could curdle fresh milk. "Well?" she demanded. "I have planted a seed," Arthur replied serenely. "What kind of seed?" "The kind that grows into confusion, blossoms into doubt, and bears the fruit of bureaucratic chaos." He glanced back at the mayor's office. "By tomorrow, Mayor Bernard will be very eager to renegotiate, and my cousins will discover that having powerful friends is considerably less comfortable than they imagined. You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "My dear Margaret, I am a simple fool who knows nothing of enjoyment. I am merely observing the natural consequences of greed and corruption." Margaret snorted. "You're impossible." "Yes," Arthur agreed happily, "but I'm also right. Now come, we must prepare for the consortium's first emergency meeting. I predict it will happen sometime around sunset, when Bernard sends them a message that their arrangement may require additional investment." "How can you possibly know that?" I patted the cheese fondly, "because I know the mayor's type, and there is nothing more dangerous to a corrupt man than the possibility that someone else might be more clever." He walked toward the inn, whistling a tune that sounded suspiciously like a funeral march, while Margaret followed, already composing the complaints she would deliver when everything inevitably went wrong before going right.
Sunset painted the village of Dustberry in shades of orange and gold, which did nothing to improve its fundamental ugliness, but at least made the mud look temporarily romantic. Arthur sat on a bench outside the Comfortable Traveler, whittling a stick into a smaller stick, while Margaret complained about the quality of the sunset itself. "Too orange," she announced. "In the capital, the sunsets were properly pink. This is a provincial sunset. You can tell by the lack of sophistication in the cloud formations." "You have remarkable opinions about meteorology, my dear." "Someone has to maintain standards. Speaking of which, your cousin Edward walked past 3 times in the last hour, trying to look casual. He's about as subtle as a camel in a bathhouse." Indeed, Edward was currently lurking behind a cart approximately 20 feet away, occasionally peeking out with the stealth of someone who had never successfully hidden from anything in his life. His attempts to invisibility were somewhat undermined by the fact that he kept waving whenever Arthur looked in his direction. "I believe," Arthur said thoughtfully, "that the consortium is experiencing some internal difficulties." "How can you possibly tell?" "Because Edward is the one they send when they want to negotiate, but don't want to admit they want to negotiate. He's the family's designated innocent fool." Arthur smiled. "It takes one to know one." As if summoned by prophecy, Edward abandoned his hiding spot and approached with the careful walk of a man who had been given very specific instructions and had already forgotten half of them. "Arthur, cousin, what a coincidence finding you here, in front of the inn, where you're staying. What are the chances?" "Astronomical," Arthur agreed pleasantly. "Won't you sit down?" Edward sat with visible relief. "I'm supposed to be subtle about this, but I've never been very good at subtle. George says I have the subtlety of a thrown brick, which I think is unfair to bricks." George has always been too harsh. How is the consortium this fine evening?" Edward's face underwent a complicated journey through several emotions before settling on confused distress. "That's actually what I'm here about, sort of, in a subtle way, which I'm not being." He lowered his voice conspiratorially, though his whisper was loud enough to startle nearby chickens. "The mayor visited us today. He's changed his mind about things." "Oh?" Arthur's eyebrows rose with practiced innocence. "What things?" "All the things. He says our documents might need additional verification. He says there could be irregularities. He says the arrangement requires additional investment." "Investment?" Margaret's ears perked up with the instinct of someone who recognized financial shenanigans at 100 paces. "What kind of investment?" "Money investment. Lots of it. He mentioned something about administrative fees and retroactive authentication costs and premium stamp services." George nearly had an apoplectic episode. He turned purple and made a sound like a distressed goat. "I imagine this unexpected expense must cause some tension within the consortium." "Tension doesn't begin to describe it. William has locked himself in the bedroom, convinced this is a divine punishment. Thomas is hiding in the cellar, demanding that someone else handle the situation. And George," Edward's voice dropped even lower, achieving a volume that was merely deafening, "George says we might actually have to pay you to go away." "Pay me?" Arthur looked genuinely surprised. "But I don't want to go away. This is my home, my family's home, the home I was born in, grew up in, and intended to die in, preferably in my own bed, rather than in this inn where the mattress appears to be filled with angry rocks." "The mattress," Margaret interjected, "is a crime on the concept of sleep." "The point is," Arthur continued, "I have no desire for money. I only want what's rightfully mine. My house, my olive grove, my family's legacy." Edward wrung his hands. "But the documents, the stamps, it's all official." "Ah, yes, the documents." Arthur leaned forward with the expression of a friendly uncle about to explain a complicated concept to a slow child. "Tell me, Edward, did you actually read those documents?" "Read them? Well, George handled all the reading. He said I wouldn't understand the legal terminology." "Did anyone besides George read them?" Edward's brow furrowed with the strain of unaccustomed thought. "I don't think so. William said his nerves couldn't handle legal documents. Thomas said he was too busy. I was told to sign where George pointed." "Fascinating." Arthur produced a piece of bread from his pocket and began feeding it to some passing pigeons, the picture of casual innocence. "You know, Edward, in my experience at the Sultan's court, I learned something interesting about official documents. The people who create them rarely expect anyone to actually read them carefully. They rely on the stamps and seals to do the work of convincing." "What are you saying?"
"I'm saying nothing at all. I am a fool, Edward. I speak in riddles and nonsense. But if I were a wise man, which I am emphatically not, I might suggest that someone should perhaps examine those documents very carefully, check the dates, verify the signatures, confirm that everything is precisely as it appears to be." Edward looked like a man who had just discovered that the ground beneath his feet might not be entirely solid. "You think George? But he's family. He wouldn't." "Of course not. Family is sacred. I'm certain those documents are exactly what George says they are." Arthur smiled serenely. "Now, why don't you run along and tell your consortium that I have no interest in their money. I only want justice, truth, the proper application of law." He paused dramatically. "Oh, and perhaps mention that I've requested an audience with the Sultan's regional inspector, who happens to be passing through the area next week. Old colleague of mine, lovely man, very interested in the proper authentication of legal documents." "The Sultan's? But that... you can't..." I haven't done anything. I'm merely a fool who writes letters to old friends. Is there something about the consortium's documents that might concern a royal inspector?" Edward fled. There was no other word for it. He ran back toward Arthur's former home with the speed of a man who had just realized he might be standing on a collapsing bridge. Margaret watched him go with grudging admiration. Is there actually a royal inspector coming? There might be, there might not be. The important thing is that they believe there might be. In my experience, the guilty flee when no one pursues. Give a corrupt man an imaginary enemy, and he'll defeat himself trying to fight shadows. What happens when they realize there's no inspector? By then, they'll have destroyed themselves with their own paranoia. Watch and see, my dear. The consortium will hold an emergency meeting tonight. George will demand money to bribe the imaginary inspector. Thomas will refuse because he's terrified of everything. William will have a dramatic collapse, and Edward, Arthur chuckled, Edward will start asking questions about those documents, uncomfortable questions, the kind that reveal uncomfortable truths. You're playing them against each other. I am doing nothing except sitting here, feeding pigeons, and being a simple fool. If the consortium happens to tear itself apart through their own greed and suspicion, well, that's hardly my doing. I merely provided the catalyst. As darkness settled over the village, sounds of argument began emanating from Arthur's former home. Even from this distance, William's dramatic wailing could be heard, punctuated by George's furious bellowing and Thomas's high-pitched demands that someone else handle the crisis. "Right on schedule," Arthur murmured. The front door of the house burst open, and George emerged, looking like a man who had just aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He marched directly toward the inn, his magnificent mustache quivering with barely contained fury. "Arthur," he bellowed, "we need to talk, privately, about business arrangements." "Of course, dear cousin. I am always available for family discussions. Margaret, my love, please ensure Sultan the donkey receives his evening meal. I believe my cousin and I have much to discuss about the flexible nature of property law." "Don't forget the cheese," Margaret called after him. "The cheese," Arthur replied, "is exactly where it needs to be, in the mayor's imagination, driving him slowly mad with desire." He walked toward his cousin with the serene confidence of a man who knew that the game had truly begun and that the consortium's foundations were already cracking under the weight of their own corruption. By morning, the cracks would become chasms, and Arthur would be there, playing the fool, ready to catch whatever fell through. George grabbed Arthur's arm with the desperation of a drowning man clutching at driftwood. "That inspector," he hissed. "How much does he know? What have you told him? Can he be managed?" Arthur smiled his most foolish smile. "Cousin, I haven't the slightest idea what you're talking about. I'm just a simple fool who lost his property to some very official stamps. Why would you be worried about an inspector?" George's eye twitched in a manner remarkably similar to Mayor Bernard's earlier performance. "We need to make a deal, now, tonight, before everything becomes complicated." "Everything," Arthur agreed happily, "is about to become very complicated indeed."
The emergency meeting of the Consortium of Rightful Inheritors convened at midnight in what had been Arthur's father's study, now decorated with George's collection of portraits, depicting himself in various poses of imagined nobility. The four cousins sat around a table littered with documents, empty wine bottles, and the shattered remains of William's nerves. "We are doomed," William announced for the 17th time, having draped himself across a chair in a pose that suggested imminent theatrical death. "The inspector will come. He will find irregularities. We will be executed, probably publicly. I have always feared a public execution." "Nobody is executing anyone," George snapped, though his confidence had developed noticeable cracks since his conversation with Arthur. The documents are mostly legitimate. Mostly? Thomas's voice emerged from behind a large cabinet, where he had positioned himself for strategic retreat purposes. What do you mean mostly? You said they were completely legitimate. You said the stamps made everything official. The stamps do make everything official. That's how stamps work. George's mustache quivered with defensive fury. The minor technicalities are technical and minor. Edward, who had been unusually quiet since his conversation with Arthur, spoke up with the dangerous tone of someone experiencing an unfamiliar sensation, independent thought. George, I've been looking at these documents, really looking at them, for the first time. Don't strain yourself, Edward. The date on this inheritance transfer, it says Father Abram witnessed the signature, but Father Abram died 3 years before this document was supposedly created. I remember his funeral. You gave a very long speech about the transience of mortal existence. A heavy silence fell upon the room. William's theatrical moaning ceased. Thomas peeked out from behind his cabinet. George's face underwent a fascinating journey from confident denial through panic to aggressive deflection. Obviously a clerical error. The scribe meant a different Father Abram. There's only one Father Abram in Dustbury's history. He founded the church 200 years ago. Then it was his descendant, a spiritual descendant. These matters are complex, Edward. You wouldn't understand. I understand that dead men don't witness signatures, Edward replied with surprising firmness. I also understand that this other document claims the property transfer was approved by the Sultan's regional office, but the seal is crooked, and it says official seal of authentication with 3 spelling errors. William sat up sharply, momentarily distracted from his performance of despair. 3 spelling errors on an official seal? That does seem problematic. The royal scribes, Thomas added nervously from his hiding spot, are known for their precision. The Sultan once executed a calligrapher for an improperly curved letter. It was considered merciful because it was only 1 execution. George slammed his fist on the table. These are irrelevant details. The mayor stamped the documents 3 times. That makes them legal regardless of minor imperfections. The mayor, Edward continued, having apparently discovered a talent for inconvenient observations, charged us 500 gold pieces for those stamps. Now he wants another 500 to handle the imaginary inspector. That's 1,000 gold pieces total for documents that might be, he searched for the diplomatic term, creative interpretations of reality. Are you accusing me of fraud? George drew himself up to his full height, which was less impressive than he believed. I am the eldest. I organized this consortium. I secured our rightful inheritance. Our rightful inheritance, William said slowly, that belongs to Arthur, whose father's will specifically named him as sole heir, which I remember because I was at the reading, hoping to be mentioned, and was bitterly disappointed. The will was lost in the fire. The fire, Thomas observed from his cabinet, that happened after you became friends with Mayor Bernard. The very convenient fire that destroyed all records except the ones supporting your claim. How remarkably fortunate. The consortium, such as it was, began to experience what diplomats might call a fundamental realignment of alliances. William and Thomas exchanged glances that suggested they were reassessing their partnership with George. Edward crossed his arms with the satisfaction of someone who had finally contributed something useful to a family discussion. Perhaps, William said carefully, we should reconsider our position. The inspector arrives in 1 week. If these documents are examined by someone competent, they'll find nothing, George insisted, though sweat was now visible on his forehead. Everything is perfectly in order. Then why, Edward asked innocently, did you insist we keep the documents locked away where no one could examine them? Why did you handle all the legal proceedings yourself? Why did you tell us not to ask questions because sophistication was beyond our understanding? Because it is. You're proving my point by asking these questions. Meanwhile, across the village, Arthur sat in his uncomfortable inn-room, playing chess against himself, while Margaret providing running commentary on his strategy. You're going to lose, she announced. I'm playing both sides. One of me must win. That's exactly what I mean. You're setting up pieces to defeat yourself. It's a metaphor for your entire approach to life. And yet, Arthur moved a knight with delicate precision, both sides believe they're winning. That's the secret, my dear. In any conflict, the goal isn't to defeat your opponent. It's to arrange things so your opponent defeats himself while believing he's being clever. Speaking of defeating themselves, what do you think is happening at the consortium meeting?
Arthur smiled. By now, Edward has discovered the irregularities in the documents. William and Thomas are realizing they've been manipulated by George.
George is desperately trying to maintain control while his allies abandon him, and all 4 of them are terrified of an inspector who may or may not exist. May or may not? I did write to my former colleague. Whether he'll actually come is another matter entirely. He's a very busy man. But the important thing is that they believe he might come, which is almost as good as him actually coming. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Margaret opened it to reveal Edward, Thomas, and William standing in the hallway with the expressions of men who had recently experienced significant revelations and weren't handling them well. "Arthur," William began dramatically, "we have come to confess our sins and throw ourselves upon your mercy." "We have come to negotiate," Thomas corrected from slightly behind the others. "There's a difference. I want that on record." "We have come," Edward said simply, "because George has been lying to us, and we'd rather be on the winning side." Arthur gestured magnanimously. "Please, come in. Margaret, perhaps some of that terrible tea. I find it aids digestion and honest conversation equally." The 3 cousins filed into the room and arranged themselves on whatever surfaces could accommodate sitting. William chose the floor for maximum dramatic effect. Thomas positioned himself near the window in case rapid exit became necessary. Edward sat on the edge of the bed with the posture of a man preparing to unburden his soul. "George created the documents," Edward announced. "He forged them. The consortium was his idea, and he recruited us by promising equal shares of the property. But we've just discovered that his version of equal shares means he gets the house in Olive Grove while we split the tool shed." "A tool shed," William moaned from the floor, "for which I sacrificed my integrity. Though, in fairness, my integrity was not worth much to begin with." "The point is," Thomas added nervously, "we're prepared to testify against George in exchange for certain considerations." "Considerations?" Arthur raised an eyebrow. "What sort of considerations?" "Not being prosecuted for fraud, not being named in any official complaints, not being mentioned to this inspector you've summoned, generally not having our lives destroyed by the consequences of our own actions." Arthur stroked his beard thoughtfully. "You want forgiveness without consequences, redemption without repentance, the benefits of honesty without having been honest." "Yes," all 3 cousins said simultaneously. "That seems reasonable." Margaret nearly dropped the tea. "Reasonable? Arthur, they tried to steal your house. They were manipulated by George, tempted by greed, certainly, but primarily deceived by someone entrusted." Arthur accepted a cup of terrible tea with grace. "Besides, I need witnesses. Witnesses who can describe George's scheme in detail. Witnesses who can explain exactly how Mayor Bernard was involved. Witnesses who are motivated by self-preservation to tell the complete truth." "You want us to betray George and the mayor," summarized. "I want you to tell the truth. If the truth happens to betray George and the mayor, well, that's hardly my doing. I'm simply a fool who asks obvious questions." Edward leaned forward eagerly. "What do we have to do?" "Tomorrow morning, Mayor Bernard will hold his public audience. Citizens bring complaints and he makes judgments. Very theatrical, very official. I intend to bring a complaint about my stolen property." Arthur's eyes twinkled. "I will need witnesses who can attest to the fraudulent nature of the documents. Witnesses who can describe who created them, who stamped them, and who profited from them." "George will deny everything," Thomas warned. "George will try to deny everything, but George will be surprised by certain revelations, revelations that will make denial difficult." "What revelations?" Arthur smiled his most foolish smile. "Have you ever noticed that corrupt men keep records of their corruption? They can't help themselves. They need to track their schemes, count their profits, congratulate themselves on their cleverness. Somewhere in my house, George's house as he believes, there is a record of every payment made to Mayor Bernard, every forged signature, every bribed witness. George is too vain to resist documenting his own genius." "The locked box in his bedroom," Edward breathed. "He never lets anyone near it. He says it contains sensitive business documents." "How remarkably specific." Arthur set down his teacup with ceremonial precision. "It would be unfortunate if those documents somehow became available for public examination. Fortunate for justice, of course, but unfortunate for George and the mayor." William sat up from the floor with theatrical determination. "I know where he keeps the key. He thinks I don't know, but I watched him hide it. In the hollow leg of the dining table, the one Father carved before he died." "My father carved that table," Arthur said quietly. "It would be appropriate, I think, for it to play a role in recovering what he left me."
The three cousins looked at each other with the dawning recognition that they were no longer passive participants in someone else's scheme. They were active agents in their own redemption, guided by a fool who was considerably wiser than he appeared. "Tomorrow," Arthur announced, "the consortium of rightful inheritors will officially dissolve. Justice will be served, and Mayor Bernard will learn that there are some things that cannot be made official with stamps, no matter how many you use." "What about the cheese?" Margaret asked. "The cheese," Arthur replied serenely, "has served its purpose, though I may let Bernard smell it one more time, just to remind him of what he could have had if only he had chosen wisdom over corruption." The night deepened around them, full of conspiracy and hope, as the pieces moved toward their final positions on the board that only Arthur could see completely.
The morning of Mayor Bernard's public audience arrived with the sort of crisp clarity that suggested the universe was paying attention. The village square had been arranged with ceremonial precision. Bernard's ornate chair positioned on a raised platform, his chain of office polished to theatrical brilliance, and rows of benches filled with villagers eager to witness the entertainment that local justice inevitably provided. Arthur arrived early, dressed in his most humble traveling clothes, carrying nothing but a walking stick and an expression of innocent bewilderment. Margaret walked beside him, her complaints about the early hour serving as effective camouflage for the razor-sharp attention in her eyes. "You look too innocent," she muttered. "No one will believe it." "The key to appearing innocent, my dear, is to be so obviously innocent that suspicion becomes impossible. Only the guilty try to look normal. The truly innocent look slightly confused and vaguely disappointed by the world. You've been practicing that look in the mirror, haven't you? Every morning for 30 years. It served me well in 3 royal courts and one very unfortunate incident involving a diplomatic mission to the eastern provinces." The benches filled with villagers, merchants, farmers, and the generally curious. Among them sat William, Thomas, and Edward, each carrying concealed beneath their robes a selection of documents retrieved from George's locked box during a midnight operation that William had dramatically described as the redemption heist. George himself arrived late, sweating despite the cool morning air, his magnificent mustache showing signs of nervous neglect. He positioned himself near the mayor's platform with the confidence of a man who had purchased said confidence at considerable expense. Mayor Bernard emerged from his office with the theatrical grandeur of a man who genuinely believed his own performance. He settled into his chair, adjusted his chain of office, and surveyed his domain with satisfaction. "Citizens of Dustbury," he announced, "I, Mayor Bernard, legitimate holder of the sacred chain of office, will now hear your petitions and dispense justice with the wisdom granted to me by my position. Who comes first before this court of absolute fairness?" Several minor disputes were handled with predictable corruption. A boundary disagreement was resolved in favor of whoever had paid Bernard most recently. A merchant's complaint about unfair taxation was dismissed with the observation that all taxation was perfectly fair because Bernard had declared it so. The audience watched with the resignation of people accustomed to entertainment replacing justice. Then Arthur rose from his bench and approached the platform. "Your Magnificence," he began, prostrating himself with exaggerated humility, "I am but a simple fool, recently returned from the capital, seeking only to understand a small confusion regarding my family's property." Bernard's eye twitched with recognition. The cheese, the inspector, the promise of wisdom that have been dangling just out of reach. "Ah, yes, Arthur, the matter of the inheritance dispute." "Indeed, Your Magnificence. You see, when I left this village 15 years ago to serve the Sultan, I was the sole heir to my father's estate. His will was clear. The witnesses were numerous. The legal procedures were followed precisely." Arthur's voice carried across the square with practiced projection. "Yet upon my return, I discover that my home has been occupied by a consortium claiming ownership through documents I have never seen, authenticated by stamps I do not recognize." George stepped forward with aggressive confidence. "Those documents are perfectly legitimate. You authenticated them yourself, Mayor Bernard. 3 stamps. The matter is settled." "Is it?" Arthur turned to face his cousin with an innocent curiosity. "Tell me, George, who witnessed my father's supposed transfer of property to this consortium?" "Father Abram, of course. It says so clearly on the documents." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Old Marcus, the village's unofficial historian, stood up from his bench.
Father Abram died 23 years ago. I attended his funeral. George, you gave a speech about the transience of mortal existence. Very long speech. We all remember. The color drained from George's face with remarkable speed. A different Father Abram, a spiritual descendant. There's only one Father Abram in Dustbury's history, old Marcus replied. He founded our church 2 centuries ago. Are you claiming a 200-year-old ghost witnessed your documents? Bernard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. These are minor technicalities. The stamps validate the documents regardless of small errors. Small errors? Arthur produced a piece of paper from his robe. I have here a copy of the official seal used by the Sultan's regional office. Notice the precise calligraphy, the correct spelling of official seal of authentication. Now here is the seal on George's documents, which reads official seal of authentication, with 3 spelling errors and a crooked border. He held both papers up for the crowd to see. Even from a distance, the differences were obvious. Laughter began to ripple through the benches, the kind of laughter that accompanies the exposure of pretension. Forgeries can be very sophisticated, Bernard said quickly. Perhaps the royal scribes made errors that day. The royal scribes, Arthur replied, are known for their precision. The Sultan once executed a calligrapher for an improperly curved letter. It was considered merciful because it was only 1 execution. Do you believe such scribes would make 3 spelling errors on an official seal? Bernard's face had begun to match George's pallor. What exactly are you suggesting? I am suggesting nothing, Your Magnificence. I am merely a fool who asks obvious questions. Arthur turned to the crowd with theatrical innocence. But perhaps my cousins, the other members of this consortium, might have observations to share. William rose from his bench with the dramatic flair of a man who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. I confess everything. George deceived me. He created the documents himself. He forged the signatures, invented the witnesses, and bribed Mayor Bernard to stamp them with stolen seals. Stolen seals? The crowd's murmur grew louder.
Thomas emerged from his position near the exit, having calculated that confession offered better odds than flight. The seals were taken from a traveling merchant's cart 3 years ago. The merchant reported them stolen, but the investigation was mysteriously closed by Mayor Bernard. Edward stood with the simple dignity of a man who had discovered moral clarity for the first time in his life. George promised us equal shares of the property, but his private documents show he intended to keep everything for himself. He called us useful idiots in his own handwriting. He wrote that manipulating family was easier than manipulating strangers, because family never suspects family. George's face had progressed from pale to green. These are lies, conspiracies. I am being betrayed by my own partners. Your partners, Arthur said mildly, have brought evidence, the documents from your locked box, the records of payments made to Mayor Bernard, the drafts of forged signatures, the notes you kept because you couldn't resist admiring your own cleverness. He turned to Bernard with devastating innocence. Tell me, Your Magnificence, did George pay you 500 gold pieces for those 3 stamps? Bernard's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. The chain of office suddenly looked less like a symbol of authority and more like evidence of theft. And did you demand another 500 gold pieces to handle an inspector who might or might not be arriving next week? That is, administrative fees are, the procedures, Arthur continued, require honesty, truth, the actual application of law rather than the theatrical performance of law. He stepped forward, his foolish demeanor dropping away to reveal the sharp intelligence beneath. Mayor Bernard, I served in the Sultan's court for 15 years. I know how justice is supposed to work. I also know how corruption works, which is why I recognized it immediately in your magnificent performance. He addressed the crowd directly. This man has been selling justice to the highest bidder. He stamps whatever documents profit him, regardless of truth. He closed investigations when bribed to do so. He wears a chain of office stolen from a traveling theater troupe. Notice the faint traces of stage paint still visible on the links. The crowd pressed forward for a better look. Indeed, the chain showed suspicious coloring that suggested its previous use in dramatic productions. Furthermore, Arthur continued, I have written to the Sultan's actual regional inspector, a former colleague, a man of genuine integrity. He will arrive within the fortnight to examine every document this mayor has stamped during his tenure, every suspicious investigation closure, every convenient fire that destroyed inconvenient records. Bernard stood abruptly, his theatrical dignity crumbling. You can't do this. I am the mayor. I have authority. You have a costume and a stolen chain, Arthur replied.
Authority comes from the people you serve, not the seals you stamp, and I suspect the people of Dustbury are beginning to reconsider their relationship with their magnificent mayor. The crowd's mood had shifted from amusement to anger. Years of petty corruption, unresolved disputes that favored the wealthy, investigations closed for mysterious reasons, all of it rose to the surface as villagers began shouting accusations and demands. George attempted to flee but found his path blocked by villagers who had waited years for this opportunity. Bernard was stripped of his theatrical chain and confined to his office pending a proper investigation. Thomas, William, and Edward were released with stern warnings about the importance of examining documents before signing them. And Arthur stood in the middle of the square, accepting the congratulations of neighbors he hadn't seen in 15 years, while Margaret complained about the noise, the crowd, and the general inconvenience of justice. "You planned this entire thing," she accused him as they walked back toward their rightfully reclaimed home. "From the moment we arrived, the cheese, the inspector, the cousins turning against each other, all of it." "I planned nothing," Arthur replied serenely. "I merely asked questions and allowed the corrupt to destroy themselves with their own greed. The cheese was real. The inspector might actually come. The cousins genuinely discovered their own consciences. I simply arranged the circumstances." "That's the same as planning." "Is it? I prefer to think of it as gardening. I planted seeds of doubt, watered them with strategic questions, and waited for the natural growth of chaos." He smiled as their house came into view, the olive grove golden in the afternoon light. "The corrupt always believe they're clever. That's their weakness. They can't imagine being outmaneuvered by a fool." Margaret snorted. "You're not a fool. You never were." "My dear wife, I am absolutely a fool. I left a comfortable position in the capital because I couldn't resist correcting the Sultan's arithmetic. I married a woman who complains about sunsets. I care about justice in a world that rewards corruption." He took her hand with unexpected tenderness. "Only a fool would make such choices, but perhaps wisdom lies not in being clever, but in being foolish about the right things." They entered their home together, Sultan the donkey braying contentedly in the garden, the evening light filtering through windows that had witnessed 3 generations of their family. The furniture needed dusting, the olive grove needed tending. Margaret would certainly find hundreds of things to complain about in the coming days. But it was home, rightfully, legitimately, foolishly home. And somewhere in the village, Mayor Bernard sat in his locked office, denied even the consolation of the legendary cheese, contemplating the fundamental truth that Arthur had demonstrated with devastating effectiveness. The wisest fools are those who know exactly when to stop pretending.